The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the judge took his seat. The air was thick with tension, a mixture of anticipation and silent disbelief. On one side of the room, two police officers sat with smug expressions, their uniforms crisp, their eyes cold. Across from them, a black woman sat tall, her face calm but unreadable. She had been accused of a crime she did not commit, and the system was moving fast to bury her under their lies. "Your Honor," one of the officers began, standing up with confidence. "We witnessed the defendant acting suspiciously near the federal building. When we asked her to identify herself, she became hostile. She refused to comply, resisted arrest, and attempted to flee. We had no choice but to detain her." The other officer nodded along, backing up his partner's claims. Their words flowed, easily, well-rehearsed, as if they had done this 100 times before. Their voices were steady, their expressions unwavering. They were so sure of themselves, so certain that no one in that courtroom would dare question their version of the truth. The prosecutor, an older man with sharp eyes and a practiced frown, turned toward the woman sitting at the defense table. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone laced with skepticism, "do you have any response to these accusations?" The woman, Maya Carter, finally looked up. Her dark brown eyes met the judge's gaze, then flickered to the officers who had accused her. There was no fear in her expression, no panic. If anything, there was something unsettling about her calmness, something that made the officers shift slightly in their seats. She exhaled softly, as if bored by the entire process. Then, in one smooth motion, she reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a sleek black leather wallet. She flipped it open, revealing a silver badge and a laminated card with bold letters printed across the top. The entire courtroom seemed to freeze. The judge squinted at the ID. The prosecutor's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The officers, who had been sitting so confidently moments before, suddenly looked pale. Maya tilted her head slightly, studying their reactions. Then, in a voice that was calm but razor-sharp, she said, "Special Agent Maya Carter, Central Intelligence Agency." A thick silence settled over the room. It was the kind of silence that came when people suddenly realized they had made a terrible mistake. One of the officers swallowed hard. The other shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers twitching. Maya let the weight of her words settle before speaking again. "Now, let's talk about what really happened that night." The tension in the room became unbearable. The judge leaned forward, interest flickering in his usually indifferent gaze. The prosecutor sat back, unsure of his next move. The officers looked trapped, like animals caught in a corner. Maya slowly closed her badge wallet and set it on the table beside her. "Because I think we both know," she continued, her voice dropping slightly, "that your story is not quite accurate." The officers did not respond. They just sat there, their faces draining of color, knowing that the truth they had tried to bury was about to be exposed. And in that moment, the power dynamic in the room shifted entirely. The courtroom felt colder. Now, the weight of Maya Carter's words pressing down on everyone. The officers, who had walked in with smug confidence, now looked uneasy. The prosecutor cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. The judge remained silent, his sharp gaze shifting between Maya and the officers, as if trying to make sense of what had just unfolded. Maya did not move, did not flinch. She simply watched them, her expression unreadable. But inside, she could feel it, the shift, the crack in their armor. She had been in situations like this before, just not inside a courtroom. This was a different kind of battlefield, one where words and perception held just as much power as weapons. The first officer, Sergeant Daniels, finally broke the silence. Your Honor," he said, his voice slightly uneven. I don't know what she's trying to pull here, but this doesn't change what happened. She was acting suspiciously, and when we asked for ID, she refused." Maya let out a small breath, almost like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. She tapped a manicured finger against the table, thinking. Then she tilted her head slightly. "That is interesting," she said slowly, "because if I recall correctly, I provided my ID immediately." The second officer, Reynolds, shifted in his seat. That's not true. His voice was a little too quick, too sharp. Maya turned her gaze on him, steady and unwavering. Really? Then I suppose you would not mind if we reviewed the body cam footage. Silence. Daniels glanced. At Reynolds. The judge noticed. The prosecutor noticed. The entire courtroom noticed. Maya did not push further, yet. Instead, she leaned back slightly, giving them space to make their next move. She had been trained for this, not just in intelligence work, but in understanding people, reading the small details, knowing when to press forward and when to let the enemy dig their own grave. The judge, his patience clearly thinning, looked at the prosecutor. Mr. Hendricks, does the prosecution have access to the officer's body cam footage? Hendricks hesitated, shifting the papers in front of him. He knew this was not going the way he had expected. He had walked into this case believing it was routine, 2 officers, a civilian, a simple charge. But now, he was facing something far more complicated. We were informed that the footage was lost, Hendricks finally said. Maya smiled, but it was not a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that said she already knew the answer before she had even asked the question. Lost? She echoed. That is convenient. Daniels sat up straighter. There was a technical issue with the cameras that night, he said quickly. We have documentation of the malfunction. Maya nodded, as if considering his words. A technical issue, she repeated, letting the phrase linger in the air. Then, after a pause, she said, You know what I find interesting about that? Neither officer answered. Maya's voice remained calm, but now there was a sharp edge to it. I find it interesting that the footage was fine when you approached me. It was fine when you asked for my ID. It was fine when I handed it to you. But then, right around the time you decided to fabricate a story, suddenly, there was a technical issue? The tension in the room thickened. Even the spectators in the courtroom, who had been silent observers, now leaned forward, sensing that something bigger was unraveling. The judge exhaled sharply and turned to the officers. Sergeant Daniels, Officer Reynolds, he said, his tone more serious now. Are you telling this court that the footage of this arrest, footage that could verify or disprove your claims, no longer exists? Daniels hesitated. It was an unfortunate malfunction, Your Honor, he said stiffly. We followed protocol. Maya tilted her head slightly, watching them squirm. She could feel their panic growing beneath the surface. Then she decided to make it worse. Your Honor, she said, addressing the judge. Would you like to know why these officers targeted me? All eyes turned back to her. The judge narrowed his gaze. Go on. Maya sat up straighter. I was at that location for official business. Not personal. Not recreational. Official. Reynolds let out a breath, a nervous one. That's not true. Maya did not even acknowledge him. Instead, she reached into her pocket again, this time pulling out a second document. It was a sealed envelope with the stamp of a federal agency on it. She placed it carefully on the table, not opening it, just letting its presence do the talking. The prosecutor frowned. What is that? Maya finally looked at him. Classified documentation regarding my assignment that evening. Daniel scoffed. She's making this up. Maya turned toward him, her expression perfectly still. Then, in a voice so calm it sent a chill through the room, she said, Sergeant, are you absolutely sure you want to call me a liar while sitting under oath? Daniel said nothing. The judge looked between them. Then he turned to the prosecutor. Mr. Hendricks, I assume you were not made aware of this? Hendricks looked at Maya, then at the officers. No, Your Honor. I was not. The judge sighed, rubbing his temple. We will take a recess. Maya leaned back in her chair, watching as Daniels and Reynolds hurriedly exchanged glances. They knew this was not going their way anymore. What they had expected to be a simple case of pinning a false charge on someone had turned into something else entirely, something they had lost control over. And Maya? She was just getting started. The courtroom emptied slowly as people filed out for recess, but Maya remained seated. She could feel the stares lingering on her as officers, attorneys, and bystanders whispered among themselves. This was not how things were supposed to go. Not for them. They had expected her to be just another person caught in the system, another name on a file they could manipulate. Instead, she had turned the tables before they even realized what was happening. Sergeant Daniels and Officer Reynolds huddled near the exit, speaking in hushed tones. Maya did not need to hear their words to know what they were saying. They were panicking, trying to figure out their next move. She could see it in the way. Daniels kept rubbing his chin. In the way, Reynolds' hands clenched into fists before releasing again. They had thought this was a closed case. Now, it was quickly unraveling. The prosecutor, Hendricks, approached her table. He studied her for a moment before speaking. "Miss Carter," he stopped himself, then corrected. "Agent Carter, I was not informed of your status before this case was filed." Maya met his gaze, unimpressed. "No, you were not." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "I do not like surprises, and right now, I feel like I walked into a game I did not sign up for." Maya leaned forward slightly, keeping her voice calm. "Then maybe you should ask yourself why these officers failed to mention the full truth when they gave their statements." Hendricks exhaled sharply and glanced toward the officers, who were still deep in conversation. His frustration was clear. He was realizing, perhaps too late, that he had been given a flawed case. Before he could say anything else, Maya stood. "Recess will not last forever," she said simply. "I suggest you decide which side of this you want to be on before we walk back in." Then, without waiting for a response, she walked toward the hallway, leaving him standing there. Outside the courtroom, the tension did not disappear. It followed Maya as she stepped into the corridor, where a few officers stood talking. The moment they saw her, their conversation died. She felt their eyes on her, filled with suspicion, maybe even something worse. But she did not slow down. She was about to turn toward a quieter hallway when a voice called her name. "Maya?" She stopped, her muscles tensing slightly before she turned. A man in a dark suit stood a few feet away. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with graying hair and sharp eyes. Someone she had not seen in years but had never forgotten. Director Samuel Pierce. Maya exhaled slowly. "Director." He walked toward her with the same measured steps she remembered from years ago. "I did not expect to see you here," he said, his voice low but firm. Maya crossed her arms. "Neither did I." Pierce studied her, his expression unreadable. "This case, it is more complicated than it seems." Maya held his gaze. "I figured that out the moment they tried to lie under oath." Pierce sighed, glancing toward the courtroom doors. "You have made this difficult for them." Maya's lips twitched slightly. "Good." He looked at her for a long moment before nodding. "Watch yourself, Carter. This is not just about you." Then, with a final glance toward the officers, down the hall, he walked away, disappearing into a restricted section of the building. Maya stood still for a moment, processing his words. She knew Pierce well enough to understand that his warnings were never empty. If he was here, then this case was bigger than she had initially thought, and that meant she needed to be even more careful. When she re-entered the courtroom, the energy had shifted again. Daniels and Reynolds were seated, but their expressions were tight, guarded. Hendricks looked tense, as if he was weighing his options. The judge was already in his seat, tapping a pen against his desk. As soon as Maya sat, the judge spoke. "We are resuming." His tone was clipped, impatient. "Now, before we move forward, I want clarification on something." He turned toward Hendricks. "Has the prosecution reviewed the classified documentation Agent Carter presented?" Hendricks cleared his throat. "Your Honor, due to the nature of the document, we are unable to fully disclose its contents in open court." The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. "But you have verified that it is legitimate?" There was a pause. Then, reluctantly, Hendricks nodded. "Yes." Maya remained still, but inside, she knew that moment had shifted everything. Whatever false charges they had tried to pin on her would not hold, not with that confirmation. But the real question was, why had they tried in the first place? The judge turned to the officers. "Sergeant Daniels, Officer Reynolds, given this new information, do you wish to revise any part of your statement?" Daniels' jaw tensed. "No, Your Honor." Maya caught it. The way his fingers twitched, the way he avoided direct eye contact. He was still holding onto his lie, even as it collapsed around him. The judge exhaled, clearly displeased. Very well. We will proceed. But as the case continued, Maya could not shake the feeling that this was far from over. If anything, it was only the beginning.